In recent years, mainstream media has been more interested in covering stories related to gender and sexuality. However, there is not a widespread understanding of what gender identity really is and how it relates to sexuality. My name is Milo Obourn. I'm the chair of Women and Gender Studies at SUNY Brockport, and I'm here today with...
Hi, I'm KaeLyn Rich. I'm an author, speaker, activist, and a sometimes faculty member at Brockport teaching about LGBTQ issues and feminist issues.
And we're here today to talk to you a little bit about what gender identity is and isn't. So KaeLyn, what would you say if I asked you what is gender identity?
I would say gender identity is the gender that someone knows that they are. And I think what people who haven't thought about gender identity before, usually people like me who are cisgender, which means that their gender matches the sex they were assigned at birth. And I think we can talk about those terms and what they are if people are unfamiliar with them. But for a lot of people, they just don't think about their gender their whole life because they don't have to, because it all matches up for them. But everybody has a gender identity. Everybody has a sense of the gender that they are. And that's really, in like really simple terms, what it is.
For those people who might not be familiar with those different terms, can you say a little bit about the difference between sex assigned at birth and gender identity and maybe gender expression?
So sex assigned at birth is a term that a lot of people have heard as other ways. So people tend to think of sex and gender as the same thing. And I'm not necessarily arguing in terms of those words themselves that they're not, but what I'm talking about here is a little different. It's assigned sex. So that means that when a person is born into the world, in US culture at least, and a lot of cultures around the world, the doctor or midwife or whoever is there makes a snap decision about what gender that person is and that's the sex that they assign them, right? In US culture, it's usually determined by external genitalia, possibly sometimes chromosomes. So they really focus on external genitalia in a way that's kind of and the assumption is that that baby will grow up to have a gender that corresponds to that decision that whoever was there at birth made about them. And for people who are like that and who are like me, the term for that is cisgender. But there are lots of people who are not like that. There are just so many people, and there always have been people whose sex assigned at birth either isn't clear or doesn't clearly fit into a binary of like male-female. That would be called intersex. And then there's also a lot of people who their sex assigned at birth doesn't line up with the gender that they actually are.
So people like me, for example, who was assigned female at birth, but identify as transmasculine. And I think another thing that people get confused about is that not only is sex assigned at birth mean nothing in relationship to your gender identity, and that the only person who can say what your gender identity is you, right, is that gender expression also doesn't necessarily correlate to gender identity. So if I decided to wear a dress tomorrow, that wouldn't make me any less of a trans person, right? It would just mean that I wanted to express myself by wearing a dress on that day, so that you can't tell how someone identifies, and you always have to ask the person what their gender identity is. And that is true for everyone, right? Not just people that we assume to be trans. I think there's also this perception that because this issue has been in the news only more recently, that that gender identity itself is a new thing, or that gender identities that fall outside of male and female are new things. But of course, that's not the case.
Honestly, the United States is sort of behind many other areas of the world in terms of thinking. There are many cultures around the world that have third genders, that have people whose gender is more expansive than this like binary idea of gender. There are cultures where there are several different genders, right? And a sense of gender fluidity, that gender can change over time. These concepts are not necessarily new in the US, in that transgender people, gender nonconforming people, have literally always been a part of our history, but they are getting more attention right now. I think, honestly, because there's also been, for better or worse, like an expansion in interest in telling the stories of transgender people. So we're seeing more, sometimes positive representation of transgender people in the media, which has made more people aware that transgender people exist. Just wasn't on their radar before. We've also seen on the political side, you know, in the post-marriage equality world, there's been like a post after that, like kind of like backlash against transgender people. I think because they're kind of seen as like a next easy target.
I'm thinking about how pushback against trans rights or any kind of legislation that's limiting, trans freedom is not just about transgender people, although we are the ones who are like primarily targeted first, but it's really about maintaining certain kinds of gender norms. And as you were talking about the relationship between sex, gender identity, and gender expression, that's really about creating fear around falling outside of those expectations, the expectation that your gender identity will match the sex you're assigned at birth and that your gender expression will somehow match, your gender identity. And I'm thinking about how that impacts like so many people outside, not only trans people, but cisgender people as well, that we're all subject to certain kinds of expectations about how we should or should not perform our gender identity and what's safe and what's not safe and what's okay and what's not okay and what will help us get a job and what won't help us get a job, what's okay in terms of dating or not dating. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about pushing back against some of the anti-trans discourse that's out there.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I hear a lot from people who are like me, cisgender, and just maybe aren't as involved in this work, is that they're like, well, I don't really know any transgender people, which is funny because the answer is really you don't know any transgender people that you knew were transgender, right? You definitely have encountered people in the world who are, and it's not in your radar, or it's none of your business is the other part of it. It's like you can't look at someone in the world and know what their gender is. You can't look at me and know what my gender is, right? But we assume that we can because we assume that gender expression and gender identity line up in that way. And then, of course, we know that's really not how that works. Limiting how people can express their gender limits all of us in how we can express our gender. It seems almost a silly example now, but it really was not silly. 100 years ago, there was a time when women could not wear pants. That was considered a gender transgression. That was considered like too masculine. I was working on a bill in New York State that finally passed in 2019. It took a really long time. The Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act, which basically makes New York a state where gender identity and expression is protected in several specific ways. That is not true across the U.S. And in working on that bill, one of the things that came up in terms of how people were prosecuted or harmed by a lack of protection is that even for some people who were maybe not even gay or lesbian, but who just had a different kind of gender expression, right? For example, there are workplaces where they have a really specific dress code based on gender, right? Not all women want to wear pantyhose and skirts every day, right? And so this obviously is primarily about protecting the people who are most impacted by gender-based discrimination, and that's going to be transgender and gender non-binary people. But it also creates a protection for people who don't want these sort of sexist gender ideals around gender expression in their workplace as well.
As you were talking, I was just thinking historically as well, and the ways that gender norms have been used in the United States primarily to pass property through wealthy white families, and how heteronormativity and gender norms are very essential for that, and how those gender and sexual norms also leave out anyone who is working class or an immigrant or a person of color. So it's not just trans and queer people. What is your vision for how people can kind of think about liberation for gender expression, get involved with movements?
I mean, there's a lot of actions you can take. And unfortunately, this is an issue that's going away. So, when you're watching this video, this is an issue that's probably in the news. I would say follow transgender people's lead. If you are cisgender like me, follow organizations led by, read books written by trans people, really try to understand a lived experience that's not your own before you step out into the street or up to the megaphone, and figure out how you can amplify those voices. From that, you will figure out what are the things that people need right now and how can I help?
I think I would say something very similar. For other trans people, I want us to find each other and figure out what our actual shared concerns are, because people have such different experiences of it, but the system that is oppressing us is the same system. And for cisgender people to listen to what trans people have to say, and take us seriously, and also to think about how normative understandings of gender harm you, right, and harm you in all of your identities, so that we can think about really a more liberated way of moving through the world that just centers our joy and our self-expression, and doesn't center expectations around how we have to behave according to rules that somebody else made up that really weren't for us.
If you found this interesting and you want to learn more or even talk more about things like race, class, gender, sexuality, and how they all intersect, check out the Department of Women and Gender Studies at SUNY Brockport.